It's a term behind that which would probably better be translated assassins. Although if you murder someone, if you assassinate someone, you're a murderer. There's no doubt about that. But they were assassins, Jewish assassins. And notice how many this one Egyptian Jew had, 4,000 behind him. He wasn't the only leader in the group. We've got thousands of these men. And then the Jews feel sorry for themselves when the Romans come and conquer their city and their nation and disperse the people. Well, they had to. The Jewish people were a rebellious group of people. And you've got all of these assassins running loose, murdering Jews who have pro-Roman sympathies. What else do we know about Felix? Well, we know a few things about him in his relation to Paul from Acts chapters 22, 23, and 24. Felix was the prefect or the procurator at Caesarea when Paul was arrested here in Acts 21. And let's notice some of the connecting links here in this story. We'll begin in chapter 22. We see Paul arrested here in the end of 21. He goes on to give his speech then. I'm just going to give you selected verses and we'll tie this story together of Paul's relation to Antonius Felix. Chapter 22, verses 24 through 30. The chief captain commanded him to be brought into the fortress and bade that he should be examined by scourging. He knows he's not that Egyptian Jew, but he's some type of rebel because he's causing a tumult. Although notice that the Jews are after him, and it's not the Romans. That he might know wherefore they cried so against him. And as he bound him with thongs, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, see, if you're like me, I just have a better comprehension, a better view of these things. You don't just read things for the spiritual import when you can kind of picture where Antonia was in relation to the temple precincts and how many soldiers are there. They have a chief captain over them. You've got centurions there. You can picture all of this then. He said to the centurion that stood by him, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who's a Roman when he's not had a fair trial? He's uncondemned. That's one of the blessings of Roman citizenship. When the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, take heed what thou doest, for this man's a Roman. Then the chief captain came and said unto him, tell me, art thou a Roman? He said, yea. Now see, that's a little confusing because he had just told the man, I'm a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia. So that's why he comes and questions him. Now how can you be a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia and you're also a Roman citizen? Obviously he's not from Rome. You wouldn't have to be from Rome to be a Roman citizen. We'll discuss citizenship in the Roman Empire later. The chief captain answered, with a great sum obtained I this freedom, but Paul said, I was freeborn. That's a little difficult to know what Paul meant by that. We'll try to cover that later. Then straightway they departed from him, which should have examined him. The chief captain also was afraid after he knew that he was a Roman, because he had bound him, which was unlawful. On the morrow, because he would have known the certainty whereof he was accused of the Jews, he loosed him from his bands and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. And you'll find comments, along this line of what was lawful and what's not, if you're on the list of some of those getting the book by Ian Shure and White, Roman Law and Roman Society in the New Testament, because you've got excellent comments on these various procedures that are developed not only in the Gospels, but furthermore and later here in the book of Acts. Now in chapter 23 you just have basically, to begin with anyway, the first 9 verses, a fulfillment of what chapter 22 ends by saying. He calls the Sanhedrin more or less together. This is the chief captain. We don't have Felix in the picture yet. This is Claudius Lysias. And we'll skip down to verse 10. Paul sets the Sadducees against the Pharisees by bringing up resurrection, because the latter don't believe in that and the former do. When there arose a great dissension, the chief captain, fearing lest Paul should have been pulled in pieces of them, commanded the soldiers to go down and to take him by force from among them and to bring him into the fortress, back into Antonia. And Paul must be sleeping in here. The night following, the Lord stood by him and said, be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome. So when Paul appeals to Caesar later on in the book of Acts, he's not missing God, because Jesus is already telling him you're going to go to Rome, and that's the way he made it to Rome. Now verse 12 is interesting. We can't be dogmatic on who these men were, but it is obviously a good suggestion. They are also part of the Sicarii. When it was day, certain of the Jews banded together, bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. Why? Paul seems to have almost pro-Gentile sympathies, because remember what caused him to be arrested back in the end of chapter 21 to begin with was a false report, a false rumor that was spread that Paul had taken Trophimus beyond, who was a Gentile and not a Jew. He had taken Trophimus beyond the court of the Gentiles, beyond the court of the women, into the so-called court of the Jews. And there was an inscription posted between the court of the Gentiles and the court of the women, both in Greek and in Latin and in Aramaic, that if a Gentile passed that gate, then it would be upon pain of death. It would cost him his life. And so they're saying that Paul took Trophimus, a Greek, a Gentile, into the temple. So what does he appear to have? Pro-Greek, pro-Gentile, therefore probably pro-Roman sympathies. So who are these men? They're assassins, that's for certain. They're wanting to assassinate Paul. Whether they are part of the Sicarii cannot dogmatically be stated, because the term does not appear here. They could just be other religiously minded Jews who are so opposed to Paul because he evidently is opposed to the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the religious leaders of Jerusalem and of Palestine. But it is a suggestion, and it's very likely. I guess, if I want to give percentage, I couldn't really give more than 50%, but that's a good percentage. There's 50% that he could be, 50% they could be, 50% they could not be. But it is a possibility they could be part of the Sicarii. They were more than 40 which had made this conspiracy. That's not too many, because there were 4,000 together earlier in Jerusalem. So you'd pick 40 out of some local group of the Sicarii around, and we know what happens. It's reported by Paul's nephew to the chief captain. And so skipping along in this chapter over to 23, Claudius Lysias, the chief captain, called unto him 2 centurions. He has probably at least 6 there, saying, make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea. Now see, they're down in Jerusalem, because that's where Antony is. And horsemen 70, and spearmen 200 at the 3rd hour of the night. Here are some various other divisions of the Roman army. You could still have soldiers who were expert spearmen, and they would be accounted as the spearmen here. You've got some of the equestrian order who ride the horses, and provide them beasts that they may set Paul on and bring him safe unto Felix the governor. Where's Felix at this time? Up in Caesarea. He wrote a letter after this manner: Claudius Lysias unto the most excellent governor Felix sendeth greeting. This man was taken of the Jews, and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. Well, of course, he's rearranging the chronology of the story. He didn't understand he was a Roman until he just about beat the pulp out of him. And when they had known the cause wherefore they accused him, he brought him forth into their council, whom I perceive to be accused of questions of their law, but have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or bonds. And see, he really doesn't know all of that. Only inclination he has is the things that Paul has told him. When it was told me how that the Jews laid wait for the man, I sent straightway to thee, and gave commandment to his accusers also to say before thee what they had against him. Farewell. Then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul, brought him up to Antipatris, one of the cities founded that we've discussed earlier, on the morrow, which was on the way between Jerusalem and Caesarea. They left the horsemen to go with him, and returned to the fortress. Who, when they came to Caesarea, and had delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before him. When the governor had read the letter, he asked of what province he was. And when he understood that he was of Cilicia, then he said, I'll hear thee when thy accusers are also come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall. And notice he is described here, designated here as governor, which was the loose term for the prefect. Pontius Pilate's called governor in Luke 3 and verse 1. Here Felix is referred to on several occasions. Verse 33, verse 34, as governor. But this is Antonius Felix. Then, of course, in chapter 24, his accusers finally come. They have a hired orator, Tertullus, with them. Verse 2, when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, seeing that by thee we enjoy great peace, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence. Well, that's kind of a ha-ha flattering remark there. No worthy deeds are being done by Felix to the people. We accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. And he goes on and gives his statement of Paul's case, and in verse 10, we have Paul. Then Paul, after the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, answered, and this little phrase is a little difficult to interpret chronologically, although one suggestion may be one of the first statements I gave you under Antonius Felix. Forasmuch as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation. Well, Felix begins his rule as prefect in AD 52. Paul's arrested in AD 57. I guess it's a topic of discussion whether you could count 5 years as many years. If that can't be counted as many years, but maybe a few years, you could remember that he held a post under Commanus in Samaria for several years prior to the time when he was appointed by the emperor prefect of Judea. If we take both of those things into consideration, then they would add up to what we would call many years and not just the few 5 years. A judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. Verse 22, when Felix heard these things, having more perfect knowledge of that way. Why do you think he's got some knowledge of that way? His wife. He's married to a Jew, Drusilla. And Drusilla, since she is a Jew, obviously there's such tension between the Jews and the Christians, she must know something about Christianity and its beliefs. Felix had more perfect knowledge of that way. He deferred them and said, when Lysias, the chief captain, shall come down, I will know the uttermost of your matter. And he commanded a centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty. This is up in Caesarea now. And that he should forbid none of his acquaintance to minister or come unto him. And after certain days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, here's the one time where she's mentioned, so you need that as a reference to her name, Acts 24:24, which was a Jewess. Then he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. Drusilla would probably be interested in hearing this man's testimony. Obviously, a person like Drusilla would not be ignorant of the name Paul the Apostle. I mean, he's so famous. He's traveled throughout the world. He's the famous apostle. He's been in and at Jerusalem, and he's been around Palestine, and now he's been here for these several days or weeks or months. She would no doubt want to hear something about him. She knows something about Christianity, and so he's brought, and both she and her husband, Antonius Felix, listened to his testimony. And as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled. We're not told what Drusilla did, but Felix trembled and answered, go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I will call for thee. He hoped also that money should have been given him of Paul, that he might loose him. Wherefore he sent for him the oftener, and communed with him. Many conversations between this Roman prefect. Better conversations, no doubt, between Paul and Felix and between Jesus and an earlier prefect, Pontius Pilate. Well, more problems with the Jews in general caused Felix to have to make a trip to Rome in AD 59. Nero is now emperor, and Nero decides against him in allowing him to continue as prefect, and so it's taken from him in AD 59. Now, in the last couple of years of his reign, from 57 to 59, we know that he had gone so far, so many times in offending the Jews. Now they present their case before the Roman emperor. Remember, the Jews are always making trips to Rome to complain about the Roman prefects or whoever is leader appointed by Rome over them. He's offended them so many times that the last couple of years during his life, he starts making the attempt to do good things for the Jews, to leave a good impression on them. And notice how this is brought out in this last verse, the last couple of years of his prefectship, the last verse of Acts 24. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus, now he's the next prefect we'll be to in just a moment, came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. So it's just interesting how circumstances, providential circumstances, work things out and dictate that certain things take place and that others do not. If this had been a little earlier during his reign, Felix may, this is speculation, have released Paul because he liked to anger the Jews, he liked to offend them. But now he's getting down to the last years of his reign, he's having more and more problems of offense with the Jews. Eventually, he can probably read the handwriting on the wall. He's going to be called to Rome, and he's going to have to do something to leave a good impression, and hopefully the Jews will be in his favor. And so here's one important thing that he does, and it cost Paul 2 years of his life, from 57 to 59 A.D., when he's under more or less house arrest in Caesarea. Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. Okay, this verse then introduces us to the next prefect, Porcius Festus, A.D. 59 to 62. Number 12 on your list of prefects, Porcius Festus, A.D. 59 to 62. First time he appears in Scripture is Acts 24:27, and then we'll also see him in chapter 25 and chapter 26. Now Josephus said that he was much more agreeable in nature than Felix, but that very little happened during his rule. Very little that was of any significance happened during his rule. Okay, we have to get this last verse again. But after 2 years, Paul was arrested in 57. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, that is his place, which was that of the prefect in Palestine. So we know that this only took place during the last 2 years of the reign of Felix, from 57 to 59. 59, Felix comes on the scene. Or Festus, rather. Now, when Festus was come into the province after 3 days, this is during the very beginning now of his rule, 59 A.D. After 3 days, he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Paul has been in Caesarea, and he is still in Caesarea the whole time. Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul. Now, this has been 2 years running now, but the Jews, the high priest, have not given this up yet, and besought and desired favor against him, that he would send for them to Jerusalem. And of course, here's Luke's interpretation, laying wait in the way to kill him. Bringing him to Jerusalem to try him. And he's going to ask Paul about that, and Paul's going to say, no, to go to Jerusalem means I'm going to end up dead because the Jews were going to kill me on the way, and so I appeal to Caesar. We'll see that as we read. Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him. When he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down into Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. When he was come, the Jews came down from Jerusalem, stood round about, and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. See, you've got a new prefect now, so it's time to resume the charges and resume the accusations against Paul, hoping for his life. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, nor the temple, nor Caesar have I offended anything at all. But Festus, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul. Here's where he asked him this question. This is what the Jews have asked Festus to do with Paul earlier in this chapter. Wilt thou go up to Jerusalem, and there be judged of these things before me? There's really no need to do that. But what are we told? Willing to show the Jews a pleasure. That's why he does it. The judgment hall, the place of judgment's back in Herod's judgment hall and Herod's palace back in Caesarea, not in Jerusalem. Then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to have been judged. To the Jews I have done nothing wrong, as you very well know. For if I be an offender, had committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, evidently the Jews, hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Then unto Caesar thou shalt go. Now we're going to read some more about Festus, but we're going to read some more about him in the context of the next leader we're going to discuss here in a moment. Festus is a man ignorant of religious matters. He's just the opposite of Felix. Felix is married to a Jewish wife, remember. Felix understands. He has more perfect knowledge, understanding of that way. Festus is ignorant of religious matters. Notice verse 19. Doesn't even know how to settle the issue. And so he's going to call on another man to help him, but had certain questions against him of their own superstition and of one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And then notice verses 26 and 27. Of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Verse 27, for it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, that is to Caesar, to Rome, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. See, Festus is having a difficult time interpreting this dispute between the Jews and the Apostle Paul. What actually is the crime? He does not understand the religious nature of what's going on here, not nearly as well as did Felix. And so, of course, he calls for the help of another man, the next man we're going to study, and that is Herod Agrippa II. We won't be looking at Albinus and Florus, the last two prefects, because they are not important for our purposes. So believe it or not, after a year and a half of study, here's the last name we'll discuss, and all of these names down through the Maccabees and the Egyptian leaders, the Ptolemies, and the Syrian ones, the Seleucids. The Jewish ones, the last one, Herod Agrippa II. He is King Herod Agrippa II. So who is most important between Porcius Festus and Herod Agrippa? Remember, Porcius Festus can't determine what's going on here and the nature of this case, and so he brings the case before King Herod Agrippa II. So which of these is the most important? That is the highest ranking of Porcius Festus and King Herod Agrippa II. Porcius Festus is the highest ranking. Porcius Festus is the highest ranking, and it's a popular misconception because of the title king, that when you read these last few chapters of the book of Acts, chapter 26, the end of chapter 25 and chapter 26, I think the common picture that you probably all have picked up, and you showed that by falling for the bait of that baited question there, is that King Agrippa II is the important leader in Jerusalem. He's the important one, and Festus more or less has to bow to him in bringing the case of the Apostle Paul before him. Whenever you see that's not true at all, then of course it will rearrange your thinking, and you'll have a different psychological outlook on the last half of chapter 25 and all of chapter 26. King Herod Agrippa II, he ruled from AD 50 to 100, 50 years, lived to be a very old man. Remember that he was only 17 whenever his father, Herod Agrippa I, died. Claudius, who was emperor at this time, thought about making him ruler in his father's place. Herod Agrippa I died, then Herod Agrippa II, his son. Claudius the emperor thought about making him ruler in his father's place, But he was warned against that by his advisors in Rome, who obviously said that the Jews were too troublesome for a mere boy of 17 to rule over them. That's why in AD 44, Rome reverted to the prefects, remember. So he's about 23 whenever he comes to rule in AD 50. He's 17 in AD 44 whenever his father dies. You can notice back on your chart how he figures in, your genealogy. Agrippa the First, we've looked at Drusilla, first of all married to a king of a Syrian city. Then she marries Felix. They have Agrippa, Drusilla, and Agrippa the Third, or whatever you want to make him, die in the eruption of Vesuvius in AD 79. Far left-hand side of the descendants of Agrippa the First, you see Agrippa the Second. That's the man we're talking about. That's the Agrippa who's referred to as King Agrippa. If you'll look back in chapter 12, the first verse of chapter 12, this Agrippa, remember, is only referred to as Herod in Acts. He's called Herod the king, but I mean he's not called Herod Agrippa. And probably Luke is just making a distinction so that we don't confuse the men, although we know them as Herod Agrippa number 1, Herod Agrippa number 2. It would be difficult to know that if all you have is the book of Acts, because you'd read Acts 12:1, now about that time Herod the king. That's Herod Agrippa the First, who was king, temporarily king from AD 41 to 44. Then, when you jump all the way over into Acts chapter 26, like verse 27, and here you read, King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? Then you don't see any relationship between Herod the king and King Agrippa, but there is, father and son. Herod Agrippa the First, who was king, Herod Agrippa the Second, who was king. Okay, anyway, I was saying that whenever Herod Agrippa the First died, because his son was not yet come of age, he was only 17. That's why the Roman advisors to Claudius emphasized the fact that because the Jews are such a troublesome group of people, it would never work. It would never be appropriate for just a mere boy of 17 to rule over them. And so, as a result, they go back to the prefects, and we have the prefects that we've discussed. However, Agrippa the Second's in the background all along. He's only 17, and it'll be 23 whenever he comes to the throne as king, as it were. But he hasn't passed off the scene by any means. He's in the background this whole time. For instance, when his uncle Herod, here's another Herod, when his uncle Herod died in AD 48, then Claudius gave his territory to Herod Agrippa II. Again, you need to look on your chart so you can see who this Herod is. He's another one of the descendants, one of the sons of Aristobulus, which makes him, of course, a brother to Agrippa the First. He's on the far left-hand side of the chart, right about the middle. I have Herod married to Mariamne. Okay, of course, he's a brother to Agrippa the First. That makes him uncle to Agrippa the Second. And Herod, this Herod who's married to Mariamne, controls let's see, Jerusalem, Caesarea, Tyre and Sidon, Lebanon mountain range here. This region in here. Chalilis. Claudius gives this territory Callis or Calcis, whichever way you want to spell it. It can be spelled Chalcis, Callis or Calcis, was the territory that belonged to Herod. Whenever he dies in AD 48, it's given to Agrippa II, which is the first territory given to Agrippa II. However, the whole time he is continuing to live in Rome, Agrippa II. He lives in Rome until the year AD 53. Later, the tetrarchies of both Philip and Lysanias. Remember, that's way up north of the Sea of Galilee, which had also been given to his father, Herod Agrippa I, are given to him. The tetrarchies of Philip, Herod Philip, and Lysanias. The Herod Philip and Lysanias of Luke 3:1. And then whenever Nero becomes emperor, he is friends with Nero, and Nero gives him the cities of Tiberias, as well as Bethsaida Julius. We've talked about these two cities before. Tiberias, Sea of Galilee, Bethsaida Julius, Sea of Galilee. Tiberias, Bethsaida Julius. His capital, now you're going to see how this is interesting. You never would have known this when you're studying Acts. We've got Festus. Remember, Festus is ruling here, and he's prefect of this area, part of Galilee, of Samaria, and of Judea, particularly of Judea and Samaria. Caesarea Philippi is the capital of King Herod Agrippa II. We've discussed the foundations of that Herod Philip built this and names it kind of for himself, Philippi, and after Roman Caesar as well. But it is renamed Neronius, of course, after Emperor Nero, who was the man who gave the city, in addition to Tiberius and Bethsaida Julius, to Herod Agrippa II. Now, at the same time that he received Callis or Calcis in AD 48, he also received the right to look after Jerusalem, which was an interesting state of affairs since there was a prefect there, and the prefect is stationed in Caesarea. In AD 48, Herod Agrippa II receives the right to look after Jerusalem and to appoint as well as dispose of the high priests. By the way, the first man that was assassinated by the Sicarii was one Jonathan, who was a former high priest, who obviously had pro-Roman sympathies, and he was assassinated. Now, we talked about Cumanus earlier. He was called to Rome because of his unfair treatment of the Jews. Whenever he was recalled to Rome because of his unfair treatment of the Jews, he was partially fair in some regards. He was partially fair as far as Romans doing things they shouldn't do to the Jewish people and to their religion. But it's interesting, whenever Cumanus was recalled to Rome for his unfair treatment of the Jews, Agrippa was the lawyer who argued the Jews' case. He lives there in Rome until AD 53. King Agrippa II was the lawyer who argued convincingly in favor of the Jews. So he starts off on a good foot as far as the Jews are concerned. He also is seen in Paul's account. That's probably where the only place that you know him of. That's in Acts chapter 25 and in Acts chapter 26. Here we see that he's got the title king. He is referred to as king. Festus even refers to him as, O King Agrippa, like in Acts 25 and verse 26. But this use of the term, remember, king was the highest of the Roman terms we looked earlier. This use of the term made it less than the current procurator or prefect in Caesarea. So it was just used more or less in a derivative sense because his father was a king who controlled all of this territory, remember. Herod Agrippa I controlled almost all the territory that his grandfather, Herod the Great, had. Now his son, the great-grandson of Herod the Great, Herod Agrippa II, doesn't control very much territory. It's basically all this territory up here to the north. So he's not a king as such, but he is referred to here as king, and he's referred to in other places as king. But that is what is misleading, seeing him as King Agrippa and seeing this other man, Festus, only referred to as governor. Now you know Felix or procurator or a prefect or procurator. Now you think, well, the king is greater than him. No, not so. Not at all. And the story in Acts can easily be read incorrectly because a person is assuming that the title king makes Agrippa on a higher pedestal than it does, than would be Festus. If you look in chapter 25, look at a few verses that will put his story together here. Chapter 25 and verse 13. Now after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice. Now this Bernice is a daughter of Agrippa I, and we will say more about her here in a moment. After certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to salute Festus. Now there's our best giveaway if you're reading real carefully to see that Festus is the upper one of the two. He's the upper one. Although he's not a king, being prefect makes him greater than this, quote, king, unquote, Agrippa II. We know that Herod Agrippa II did a lot of traveling. See, he was appointed ruler, more or less, the right to look after Jerusalem. So he's down in Jerusalem on several occasions. He's down in Caesarea on several occasions, although his capital is way back up in Neronius. But there's a good verse, Acts 25:13, that's a giveaway that King Agrippa is the lesser of the two when you compare him to Festus. When they've been there many days, Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king. Just kind of asking advice, wondering, you know, if this man has more insight into the affairs than he has. There is a certain man left in bonds by Felix, the former prefect, about whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. To whom I answered, it's not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die before that he which is accused have the accusers face to face and have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. Therefore, when they were come hither, without any delay on the morrow, I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought forth. Against whom, when the accusers stood up, they brought none accusation of such things as I supposed. You know, thinking of legal matters, but had certain questions against him of their own superstition, and of one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. Because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these matters. But when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of the emperor, Augustus is not a good translation, the emperor, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would also hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, thou shalt hear him. Okay, now why would Agrippa maybe have better insight into the affairs than Festus? He's a Jew. He's a Jew. He's part Jew. Remember, Felix was married to a Jewish wife. The interlude between these two men is Festus, and he's the one ignorant about everything because he's not married to a Jew, and secondly, doesn't have Jewish blood in him. Felix didn't have Jewish blood, but he's married to a Jew, Drusilla. Now on the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice, Festus said, King Agrippa and all men which are here present with us, ye see this man, about whom all the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. Well, when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself had appealed to the emperor, I have determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and specially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination had I might have somewhat to write. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. Then Agrippa said unto Paul, Thou art permitted to speak for thyself. Okay, we'll skip over Paul's third giving of his testimony there, all the way down to verse 24. And as he thus spake for himself, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, thou art beside thyself, much learning doth make thee mad. But he said, I am not mad, most noble Festus, but speak forth the words of truth and sound-mindedness. For the king knoweth of these things, before whom also I speak freely. For I am persuaded that none of these things are hidden from him, for this thing was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? I know that thou believest. Then Agrippa said unto Paul, Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. And Paul said, I would to God that not only thou, but also all that hear me this day were both almost and altogether such as I am, with the exception of these bonds. Paul's heart's really going out, not to wicked Roman Festus, but to Agrippa, because he's got Jewish blood in him. And his heart's really going out to King Agrippa. King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? Could he say that to Festus? Believest thou the prophets? What prophets? You talking about the Greek prophets? But King Agrippa would know the prophets. Yes, that's Old Testament prophets, because he has Jewish blood in him. So you know all of that, and then the story here will make better sense for you. Now, one figure that's always coming into the picture whenever we see Agrippa coming into the picture, and that's Bernice. Okay, let's discuss her, and we will be concluding then this evening. One figure's always popping up. Who was she? She is the full sister of Agrippa II. Both of them descendants from Agrippa I. She is on your outline, the middle name of the 5 descendants of Agrippa I. Your genealogy has Agrippa II, skipping one, Bernice. You almost ought to have references, you know. You can go back and do this from your notes or tapes or something. It really will help you study this genealogy and study your notes in the future to have all the biblical references attached to each of the names here. And then you skip another one and we end up with Drusilla. Okay, she also is on your chart as formerly the wife of Uncle Herod, uncle to Agrippa II. Okay, do you see that? Go up to Herod, married to Mariamne, and then I have a little line drawn out beside that to Berenice. Do you see that on your genealogy? Okay, that's the Berenice. That's the daughter of Agrippa I. Now, Herod, first of all, marries Mariamne. She either dies or he divorces her, one or the other. Then he marries Berenice. Then he dies. So she's a widow. And in the book of Acts, she's always seen in company with her brother, her full brother, Agrippa II. There were reports that were just common knowledge, according to Josephus, that an incestuous relationship was taking place between Agrippa II and Berenice. See, remember whenever Uncle Herod died, his territory was given to Agrippa II in AD 48. And whenever he also died, then his widow, Berenice, came to live with Agrippa II. And it was just common knowledge, according to Josephus. There was nothing to prove. It was common knowledge that an incestuous relationship was taking place between Agrippa II and his full sister, Berenice, who had earlier been married to his uncle, Herod. Let's point out 3 times where she's seen. Acts 25:13. She's always seen with her, and you would think, is this her husband or what? No, this is her brother. Brother and sister. After certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea. Acts 25:13. Then verse 23, on the morrow when Agrippa was come, and Bernice with great pomp was entered into the place of the hearing with the chief captains. And then chapter 26 and verse 30. And when he had thus spoken, the king rose up, and the governor, and Bernice. She is with him every single time we see him appearing in the Lucan narrative here, in these last chapters of the book of Acts. it almost seems to then imply there is something between these two people. Luke doesn't come out and tell us what it is. Josephus does. He says it's an incestuous relationship between the two. But Luke very specifically lets us know on 3 occasions. He didn't have, why do you always add in this woman's name here? It's not his wife, it's his sister, unless you're implying something by that. Something else that we gain from this is that it's interesting, Paul never takes it upon himself to say anything about that. Now, that's something that you would never get otherwise, but it's not always necessary to correct people's faults or sins. I mean, John the Baptist, he was inspired of the Spirit to travel from way down in the Judean desert all the way up there to Tiberias just to set Herod Antipas and Herodias right. But Paul has many occasions here to really come out with a brimstone sermon against this incestuous relationship of Agrippa II and his full sister Bernice. But it's just interesting to me that Paul never makes any reference to it at all. Not that he's not concerned. Seems like he is concerned because he's trying to get King Agrippa converted. Paul's thought must be, if I get him converted, the rest of that will take care of itself. You know, John the Baptist, he was a prophet. He was an evangelist. He wasn't a missionary. He wasn't after any conversions from anybody. He was after hell and brimstone sermons for these people. Paul's wanting to get people converted, so he doesn't bring that up. He just brings up, "Oh, King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? I know that thou believest." Agrippa says, "I almost persuaded, but not quite."